Scott Oliver Hall was born on October 20th, 1958 in St. Mary's County, Maryland, 70 miles south of Washington, D.C. He grew up as an army brat and moved frequently, once every year before he was 15 years old. However, a year before he entered the wrestling business, he had a traumatic experience that would affect him for the rest of his life. In 1983, when Scott was 25 years old, he was involved in an altercation at an Orlando, Florida nightclub which he worked at. An incident occurred at the club's parking lot in which Hall, in self-defense, had to shoot a belligerent patron with the man's own gun. He was charged with second-degree murder and was sent to jail, but the charges were dropped because of lack of evidence. Hall later shared that the incident would haunt him for many years to come because he did not get the counseling he needed. Traumatized by this series of events, he sought relief in the form of athletics and professional wrestling, with which he wanted to create a career. In 1984, at the age of 26, he began his career in the National Wrestling Alliance's Championship Wrestling from Florida territory, and one of his first feuds was with the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, who was also his trainer. Mike Rotunda and Barry Windham also took the young Hall under their wing. As a developing wrestler, he did stints in Jim Crockett's Charlotte promotion and Vern Gagne's American Wrestling Association, and won tag team gold in both companies. He also met and wrestled with guys like Arn and Ole Anderson and Kurt Hennig, later known as Mr. Perfect. Gagne even wanted to push Hall as the AWA World Champion as a replacement for Hulk Hogan, who left AWA and experienced worldwide success with Vince McMahon's World Wrestling Federation. However, Gagne's plans didn't come to fruition as Hall wanted more than what AWA had to offer him and was brought into the NWA's World Championship Wrestling promotion by good old JR Jim Ross. AWA would be defunct by the turn of the decade. During this first run in WCW, he was mostly a jobber in both tag and singles action, but he got the opportunity to work with the Freebirds, Mike Rotunda, Sid Vicious, and Ron Simmons. Later, he would take a hiatus from WCW, and during that time, he attended his second of 2 tryouts for the World Wrestling Federation, but did not sign with them. He would also do short stints with New Japan Pro Wrestling, Catch Wrestling Association, and World Wrestling Council. During that time, he worked with Bam Bam Bigelow, Terry Funk, Bull Power, best known as Big Van Vader, and Fit Finlay. When Hall returned to WCW in 1991, he was renamed the Diamond Stud, which was a character similar to the WWF's Ravishing Rick Rude character. Diamond Dallas Page became his manager, and they would be close friends for the rest of Scott's life. He was incorporated into Dallas's Diamond Exchange and Diamond Mine Stables, and also teamed with members of Paul E. Dangerously's Dangerous Alliance. After wrestling a televised match on May 8, 1991, he left WCW and joined Vince McMahon's World Wrestling Federation 5 years after his first tryout. It was here that he gained his first big success as Razor Ramon and began to find himself in some of the biggest moments in professional wrestling history. 10 days after leaving WCW, he debuted for the WWF with a new character modeled after the Tony Montana and Manny Ribera characters from the 1983 film Scarface starring Al Pacino. Hall called himself the Bad Guy, and his catchphrase, "Say hello to the bad guy," was derived from 2 of Pacino's lines as Montana, "Say hello to my little friend," and "Say goodnight to the bad guy." And this character would be called Razor Ramon. Vince McMahon and Pat Patterson came up with the Razor moniker, while Tito Santana suggested Ramon, which McMahon approved. Thus the name stuck, and he was still lovingly called Razor for many years after that. Later on, Hall claimed that when he pitched the idea to Mr. McMahon and Pat Patterson, both of whom apparently never saw Scarface, they thought that Hall was a genius and was coming up with the ideas all on his own. Hall even brought his Diamond Death Drop finisher, a crucifix powerbomb, to the WWF and renamed it the Razor's Edge. As Razor Ramon, Hall made his in-ring debut for WWF television on August 8, 1992, and soon after was involved in feuds with top stars who held the WWF Championship, Randy Savage and later Bret Hart. In WrestleMania 9, despite being the heel, fans were cheering for him during his match with another former WWF champion, Bob Backlund. The first of many iconic moments he was involved in occurred on the May 17, 1993 episode of Monday Night Raw, where he suffered an upset loss to The Kid, who would later be known as the 1-2-3 Kid. It was the first match on TV in which someone regarded as enhancement talent or a jobber got a victory over someone on the main roster. In October of 1993, he would become the WWF Intercontinental Champion, defeating Rick the Model Martel, his first of 4 Intercontinental Championship runs. This was the reign where he would begin a program with the Heartbreak Kid Shawn Michaels, which would lead to the next history-making moment that Scott would be a part of. Michaels was stripped of the Intercontinental title a few months prior because of a real-life suspension. Upon his return, he claimed he was still the true champion since he never lost the title in the ring. HBK even came back with his own version of the belt. This initial part of the Razor-HBK feud led to an epic ladder match at WrestleMania 10, which was the first ladder match at a WrestleMania, and only the second ever in the World Wrestling Federation. It has been lauded as one of the greatest matches in WrestleMania's history, and set the standard for ladder matches for years to come. After WrestleMania 10, the feud would continue and would include Shawn's bodyguard Diesel, which led to their own program over the Intercontinental title. During this time, Razor also worked with the major names in both the mid-card and main event scene, including his former rival 1-2-3 Kid, British Bulldog Davey Boy Smith, Owen Hart, Jim the Anvil Neidhart, Yokozuna, Goldust, while still feuding with HBK and Diesel. His initial WWF run ended in 1996 after he and Diesel signed contracts to work for the up-and-coming World Championship Wrestling. In Razor Ramon and Diesel's final show with WWF at that point, Hall yet again found himself in another history-making moment on May 19, 1996 in Madison Square Garden, the Curtain Call. Although they were involved in feuds with each other on screen, Scott Razor Ramon Hall was associated with a group backstage called The Clique, which included Diesel, Kevin Nash, 1-2-3 Kid, Sean Waltman, Heartbreak Kid, Shawn Michaels, and Paul Levesque, wrestling under the name Hunter Hearst Helmsley. It was on this day that Hall and Nash both had their last scheduled matches for WWF before they would leave for WCW. Since Hall had already finished his match earlier in the card, a few moments after Shawn and Diesel's match ended, he made his way to the ring and gave Michaels a hug, which at first wasn't suspect because they were both faces at the time. However, the heel, Hunter Hearst Helmsley, then entered the ring, and after a group hug by all 4 wrestlers, they turned to face the crowd and raised each other's arms to the delight of fans in attendance. Though it wasn't during a TV taping, it was a significant moment in the breaking of kayfabe, especially since 2 teenaged fans smuggled a camcorder into the arena, recorded the moment, and soon after, the footage spread like wildfire thanks to wrestling magazines publishing still shots, and it may have been the very first viral video in the history of the internet, as it was widely spread on the very young but modern version of it that we know of today. As a result of it being so widely spread, for the first time in history, a major wrestling promotion was forced to acknowledge the open secret of kayfabe. On top of that, 4 of the 5 Clique members escaped punishment. Sean Waltman wasn't even at the show because he was in rehab. Scott Hall and Kevin Nash escaped punishment because they jumped to WCW. And Shawn Michaels was the WWF champion. The only one who Vince McMahon could punish was Hunter Hearst Helmsley, and in hindsight, it may have saved the WWF and the entire industry as we know it today. Hunter was actually going to be crowned King of the Ring in a few weeks' time, but that award and the push that went along with it would be given to Stone Cold Steve Austin. Without questioning it, Helmsley accepted his punishment, and it earned him the respect of the locker room, including that of The Undertaker. After his punishment was completed, Triple H went on to have a storied career in and out of the ring, to say the least. And on top of that, Stone Cold's rise to superstardom began the series of events that would lead to the ultimate victory of the WWF in the Monday Night Wars, but not before nearly being run out of business by WCW, with Hall and Nash as two of the major players. Now competing under their real names, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash formed a tag team, calling themselves The Outsiders, and used the fandom's growing awareness of backstage politics to fuel their stories. When Scott Hall re-debuted for WCW on the May 27, 1996 Monday Nitro at the Macon Coliseum, he kayfabe interrupted the broadcast, got on the microphone, and gave his infamous "You Want a War" speech, implying that he and other unsanctioned wrestlers were invading WCW, and challenged Ted Turner to pick 3 of his best wrestlers for war. A week later, Scott Hall revealed Kevin Nash to be one of his partners. Tensions would build between the Outsiders and WCW loyalists, which would culminate at WCW's Bash at the Beach on July 7, 1996. Again, Hall found himself in another seminal moment in the history of the wrestling business. In what was billed as the Hostile Takeover match, Sting, Lex Luger, and Randy Savage represented Team WCW and would take on the Outsiders Nash and Hall and a yet unnamed third member of their faction. Though it was essentially a 3-on-2 handicap match, it ended in a no contest as a result of the Outsiders continually double-teaming their opponents. However, what would happen next would make the match an afterthought. After the match was called off, Hulk Hogan made his way to the ring. The crowd was anticipating that the longtime babyface Hogan would even the odds for WCW. To their shock, he would perform the atomic leg drop on Randy Savage 3 times and then reveal that he was indeed the mystery partner of the Outsiders. Speaking in the ring with Mean Gene Okerlund, Hulk Hogan announced that he, Scott Hall, and Kevin Nash were the new World Order of Wrestling. Shortly after, Hulk Hogan would add the Hollywood moniker to his ring name. The NWO dominated wrestling's top card and headlines for years after this point, and Hall's best run with the NWO was between 1996 and 1998. During this run, he captured the WCW tag team titles 6 times, 5 of them with Nash, and engaged in feuds with the Steiner brothers, Lex Luger, the Giant Paul White, and combinations of the Four Horsemen. He even got the opportunity to fight for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship against Sting. And during this time, when the NWO splintered themselves, Hall turned on Nash to join Hollywood Hulk Hogan's faction. However, it was also during this time that his personal demons stemming from his earlier trauma began affecting his personal and professional life. On March 16, 1998, Hall showed up to the Monday Nitro broadcast heavily intoxicated and under the influence of painkillers. Shortly after this show, he was taken off TV and placed into rehab. It was also during this time when Hall's marriage to his first wife, Dana, ended after 8 years because of his substance abuse issues. And though they remarried a year later, they divorced again in 2001. After his stint in rehab, Hall and Nash joined forces once more, which contributed to another history-making moment in the industry. However, this time, it would be on the wrong side of history. By the turn of the calendar in 1999, the tide had turned in the Monday Night Wars. Though Nitro had won the ratings for 83 weeks straight starting on May 20, 1996, a week before Hall returned to WCW, Monday Night Raw took the majority of the ratings victories starting April 13, 1998. Although, the specific ratings numbers were actually still quite close. Nonetheless, WWF was gaining momentum thanks to the feud between Stone Cold Steve Austin and Mr. McMahon, as well as the emergence of The Rock. On the first Monday Nitro of the year on January 4, 1999, as had been happening for several weeks to that point, Senior Vice President Eric Bischoff told lead announcer Tony Schiavone to spoil the pre-recorded Monday Night Raw's main event for the WCW viewer to keep them from switching channels. Schiavone announced that Mick "Mankind" Foley would win the World Wrestling Federation Championship from The Rock. After announcing the result, Schiavone sarcastically remarked, "Ugh, it's gonna put some butts in the seats." Instead of keeping viewers on Nitro, WCW saw a huge drop in viewership, and those who switched over saw one of the most exciting moments in Raw's history. A no disqualification match between The Rock and Mankind, which also included the Corporation and D-Generation X engaging in ringside shenanigans, highlighted by a surprise run-in by Stone Cold Steve Austin, who gave The Rock a chair shot and dragged the beaten-down Mankind over Rock for the pinfall, with the Raw crowd absolutely going ballistic at both the sound of the glass shatter and the pinfall victory by the new WWF champion, Mankind. Those that stayed with WCW saw a sham match between Hollywood Hulk Hogan and Kevin Nash, and the infamous finger poke of doom, when Hogan poked his index finger on Kevin Nash's chest. Nash collapsed to the mat, and Hogan pinned him to become WCW champion, uniting the splinter factions of the New World Order and reuniting the Outsiders. When Goldberg ran into the arena to interrupt the celebration, the united NWO were able to overcome his attacks. Goldberg was handcuffed to the ring ropes, and Scott Hall proceeded to incapacitate him with a taser. While in hindsight, it could be seen as a creative way to unite the NWO factions and turn Kevin Nash and Lex Luger heel, it ultimately fell flat with the fans in attendance, and those that were able to watch what happened on Raw ultimately got the better of the two segments. While this wasn't the sole reason why the NWO and WCW were on a downward trend, it served as a tangible example of where both companies were going. At this point, the last head-to-head victory for WCW happened on October 26, 1998, and they would never see another victory for the rest of WCW's existence. However, things were looking more positive for Hall's singles career, as during this time he won the United States Championship from Roddy Piper and defeated Rick Steiner for the WCW World Television Championship. He and Nash also became World Tag Team Champions for the 6th time, which made Hall a 7-time WCW Tag Champ. Scott made his final appearance for WCW on February 20th, 2000. A year later, WCW would become the property of Vincent Kennedy McMahon. Following the end of his WCW tenure, Hall wrestled non-televised matches in Paul Heyman's Extreme Championship Wrestling and even returned to New Japan Pro Wrestling in 2001. Soon after, he found himself in the midst of yet another historic wrestling moment. After the World Wrestling Federation completed the Invasion storyline at Survivor Series 2001, a new story with Ric Flair began, in which he became 50% owner of the WWF as a result of buying Shane and Stephanie McMahon's stock in the now publicly traded company. Mr. McMahon was so convinced that Ric Flair was a cancer that would slowly destroy the WWF that he resolved to kill what he created by injecting a lethal dose of poison, the original NWO. On February 17, 2002, the original members of the NWO made their return to the World Wrestling Federation. Hollywood Hulk Hogan, Kevin Nash, and Scott Hall, standing in the ring that belonged to a company they at one point helped build, then nearly put out of business. Their first big feuds were with the two megastars who put the World Wrestling Federation over the top to claim victory in the Monday Night Wars: Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock. Hall feuded with Austin and Hogan with Rock, culminating in grudge matches at WrestleMania 18 in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Hall and Austin's match was a crowd pleaser, as Austin nearly stunned Hall out of his boots and took the victory. And as for The Rock and Hollywood Hulk Hogan, Icon versus Icon, the dream match, well, what else can you say except that it was greatness? Hall's time in WWF, soon to be WWE, was short-lived, as he was also part of the infamous plane ride from hell. On May 5, 2002, during a private flight from England back to the United States after the Insurrection pay-per-view, Scott Hall, among others, got heavily intoxicated. He and others were accused of behaving in a sexually inappropriate manner toward the female flight attendants. While the matter would ultimately be settled out of court, Hall wrestled one last time on the May 6 Raw. Hall was released from WWE the following day. Shortly after his WWE release, Scott was hired to compete in Jerry and Jeff Jarrett's new promotion, NWA Total Nonstop Action, now known today as Impact Wrestling, and competed in that promotion from 2002 to 2008, as well as in 2010 when he won the TNA World Tag Team Championship with his old friend Kevin Nash. During this time, he also returned to World Wrestling Council and even held the WWC Universal Heavyweight Championship. He also competed in Juggalo Championship Wrestling. In the final years of his career, he was sporadically active in the independent scene and retired for good in 2016. Although Scott Hall's problems with drugs and alcohol were made public in the late 1990s, thanks to a controversial storyline in WCW, those issues were brought to an even bigger consciousness thanks to an episode of ESPN E60, which revealed the extent of health and personal issues he faced and how it affected his life and the people around him. In terms of his substance abuse, Kevin Nash says it was the result of post-traumatic stress disorder from different traumatic moments in his life, which would include the 1983 nightclub incident. Scott recounted that he remembered everything, including sights, sounds, and smells of that day. He even admitted that he should have gone to counseling, and neglecting to get the help he needed was the most unhealthy thing he'd ever done. Though he had wrestling as an outlet, he repressed the memories of the incident and the subsequent trial as much as possible, and even suppressed his guilty feelings even though he knew he acted in self-defense, and that took a huge toll on his mental health. The repressed memories and traumas were seen in his alcohol and drug abuse, which definitely affected his professional life, but also had an effect on his personal relationships with his 2 ex-wives and his 2 children. Moreover, after a rehab stint in 2010 paid for by WWE, doctors found he had heart problems requiring him to have a defibrillator and a pacemaker implanted in his chest. He was also hospitalized for double pneumonia and diagnosed with epilepsy after he started having seizures. And yet, in 2011, he had to be treated in hospital after overdosing on opioids and psychoactive drugs. The ESPN documentary was a heartbreaking look into the life of one of the most groundbreaking performers in wrestling, and the hopelessness that Scott was experiencing while filming the special was impactful for those who worked in the industry, as well as wrestling fans and general sports fans alike. While it showed how far he had fallen from the greatest heights in the wrestling world, in hindsight, this was also a tangible moment that signified the beginning of Scott's road to recovery. It was in 2013 that his old friend Diamond Dallas Page contacted him and offered Scott to stay in his home to get sober and rebuild his life from the ground up, physically, mentally, professionally, and spiritually. A few years before, Dallas Page created DDP Yoga, which helped countless people improve their physical and mental health, and figured that he had the tools to help Hall recover. Page even initiated a fundraising drive to pay for a hip replacement surgery and dental work for his ailing friend. Scott was joining another troubled wrestler, Jake the Snake Roberts, who started with Dallas a few months before. Both Hall's and Roberts' progress were chronicled in another documentary released in 2015 called The Resurrection of Jake the Snake, and it showed how they worked with Dallas to get sober and rebuild their lives. Apparently, recovery was so successful that WWE included both men into their Hall of Fame in 2014. Scott was inducted by his best friend, Kevin Nash. When it was time for Scott to speak, he spoke candidly of his personal issues, but he looked the healthiest he'd been in years in both body and mind, and thanked Dallas Page for saving his life. Hall was inducted a second time with Nash and Hogan as the original members of the New World Order. He lived 63 years of success, failure, heartache, downfall, and redemption. Tributes have been pouring in from wrestling fans of multiple generations, and of course, his fellow wrestlers. Hulk Hogan attributed his Hollywood heel turn to Scott's tutelage on how to be a heel, and credits Hall for resurrecting his career through their work as the NWO. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson reminisced that as a student of the game, he studied Scott's matches frame by frame, and his own style was heavily influenced by Hall. Before their first singles match on SmackDown in 2002, Rock got a chance to tell this to Scott. Hall was shocked to hear this and thought it was so cool that he was so highly regarded by the most electrifying man in sports and entertainment. On Kevin Nash's Instagram post on the morning before Scott's death, he remarked that he spent more of his life with Scott than anyone else, and was blessed to have a friend that took him for face value and vice versa. Nash added that Scott wasn't perfect, but Scott always said, "The last perfect person to walk the planet, they nailed to a cross." At the 2014 WWE Hall of Fame ceremony, Scott Hall capped off his speech with a line that was a perfect description of his life story.
Hard work pays off. Dreams come true. Bad times don't last, but bad guys do.